much for our second session. My name is Haran. I'm the co-director of PONARS, and it's my pleasure to chair that session. We will be discussing points of contention, Ukraine and Syria, and we have 4 speakers. Our first speaker will be Petro Burkovskyy from National Institute for Strategic Studies in Kyiv, presenting a paper co-authored with Olexiy Haran from the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, discussing the New Deal for Donbas. Would Berlin and Paris catch up with Trump's track toward Russia? Petro, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. The topic is a New Deal for Donbas, and these words were chosen because Trump in this country is known as a deal maker. So actually, it's not a Roosevelt New Deal; it's a Trump's New Deal, which may include Russia as a part. So why we said that would Berlin and Paris catch up with Trump track towards resurgent Russia? We're not speaking about Trump himself, but we are speaking more about his team or his administration. And so, before Trump's accession to power, Washington, Berlin and Paris were practically on the same page in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict in Donbas, trying to contain violence and facilitating direct talks between Moscow and Kyiv. The new US administration maybe can accept Russia as a resurgent power, but at a certain price. Kremlin, in our opinion, would have to choose of either openly antagonizing American interests in Europe and elsewhere, and we see from the first panel that it could be the case, or embrace the role of American situational partner in Eurasia after clearing up the mess it created in the previous years. However, it is still unclear what the European partners would do to prevent Ukraine from becoming a testing ground for diplomatic and military cooperation, diplomatic and military competition, reminiscent of the Cold War. So, this is the brief executive summary of our memo. And now let me start with some key thoughts on which we built our memo. First, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is not a proxy war between Russia and the West, although the West may have a stake in it. We argue that the conflict started as Putin's reaction on the Second Maidan. Again, as in 2004, Kremlin made a bet on the wrong horse and backed Yanukovych so outwardly that the public anger against the Ukrainian president at that time swiftly transformed in outrage about the Russian intrusion during the protests in Kyiv and other places. Well, if in 2004 the first Putin's intrusion into the protests resulted in more pro-Western policies of the Yushchenko, Tymoshenko and other governments, then in 2014 it would have caused very negative backlash even if nothing like Crimea annexation hadn't happened. So then, after Yanukovych lost, then it fell with the Putin's post-war Leningrad street-smart logic. If fight is inevitable, strike fast. And he did starting the war, out of fear for political circumstances of his backing Yanukovych. As we know from Thucydides, when the war started out of fear, they are the longest and the bloodiest, comparing to the other cases. Then, to cover up his own miscalculation, Kremlin invented Western conspiracy and Ukrainian fascism, both aimed at genocide of Russian-speaking population and the weakening of Russia. It were as far as possible, including threats to use nuclear weapons to protect Russian core interests in the post-Soviet region. This was a challenge the West was not ready to defy, since the West was not behind Putin's failure in Ukraine. There was nothing to risk everything by engaging in the conflict escalation spiral. Therefore, we argue, as we argue in the paper, major efforts of American and Franco-German diplomacy were applied to limiting impact of the Russian aggression on the security in the wider region. So we argue that if it were a proxy war, the West would not invest so much effort in attempts to find political solution for the crisis in Donbas, accepting main Kremlin's demands about this region, not speaking about tacit acceptance of Crimea annexation. In memo, we show how German and French diplomats in 2015 and in 2016 try hard, proposing first it was a Morel plan, then it was a Steinmeier's formula, and we also show why they failed. We also argue that during 2014 and 2017, American diplomats followed the track of European diplomacy, with only one exception, we argue. Washington was more consistent on sanction regime, since it was far less dependent on relations with Russia. On the other hand, Obama administration restrained its military and intelligence lobby when they supposed to arm Ukraine. And due to this, there was a kind of a Euro-Atlantic consensus on Ukraine's issue. Solidarity on sanctions and agreement about avoiding actions that will be interpreted by Russia as an escalation. However, Western internal debates, even during this quite a consensus on sanctions and military assistance to Ukraine, were used by Russia to provoke divisions and disagreement in the Euro-Atlantic community. In addition, Kremlin successfully defied limited sanctions and used it as a proof of the permanent winning in eventual confrontation with the West. The concept of victory is very important in understanding Russian action in Donbas. It leads us to the second key thought. Conflict in Donbas will not be resolved until regime change either in Ukraine or in Russia. This is very important that decision makers in the West recognize this fact when they speculate about possible conflict resolution options or negotiate with Russia on a different peace initiatives. This is what the West, in our opinion, may have as a stake. Ukraine cannot be returned back to the status of the gray zone, back to the 1990s, because Russia will not accept any other outcome of the conflict in Donbas than making Ukraine its loyal, authoritarian protectorate with all consequent domestic risks. Moreover, complete victory in Donbas, in our understanding, is important for Putin's survival. First, it is crucial for him personally to be seen by the Russian people as a winner and the savior of Russia. It will prove that he was right when he started the war, annexed Crimea and ordered intervention in Donbas. Because in other case, we think he could be blamed for launching a civil war between two very close nations, both from the he would be criticized and blamed both from nationalistic and liberal Russian opposition. Therefore, we argue that if there are intentions within Trump administration to make Russia partner in crisis solution, it's a quote from Henry Kissinger, it should be done only on the basis of wide consensus with Europeans and Ukrainians, who, and I mean Europeans and Ukrainians, have serious doubts about making Russia as a partner in crisis solution. Moreover, unilateral steps like recent Trump administration steps, like threatening to deliver lethal arms to Ukraine, and at the same time discuss at the behind the closed door details on Donbas peacekeeping mission, are not good for maintaining Euro-Atlantic solidarity. On the other hand, we also see that it is difficult for Americans to comprehend why Europeans are afraid of promising Ukraine a future membership in the European Union and hesitate to share more costs of confronting Russia soft and hard pressures. Sometimes it seems that Europeans are ready to trade off Crimea and Donbas for gaining economic benefits from Russia, despite existing security concerns. And so, when there is no solidarity between the partners, there will be competing coalitions. On the one hand, there could be a US-steered coalition of willing who see Russia as a threat and who are suspicious of other big European countries dealing with Kremlin. It may lead to real escalation of power struggle between Russia and this Western coalition, which will be more damaging for all participants, but especially for European countries and to Ukraine. On the other hand, it's theoretically, but still, there could emerge a populist coalition of the European states, headed by the populist leaders elected during the elections, and US. This coalition could be open for Russia bargaining about spheres of influence not only in the European region but also in some other places like Middle East. So, what will do Ukraine in this situation? The third key thought of our memo, behind our memo is that Ukraine is going to behave according to the reformulated Yitzhak-Rabin formula. Fighting with Russia in Donbas as if there were no negotiations, while continuing all formats of international negotiations as if there were no hostilities in Donbas. It means that Ukraine is not going to accept the role as being a battleground for provoking regime change in Russia. Our Ukrainian request toward the West is limited to its own independent survival as a state. At the same time, Ukraine will do everything to block any efforts, whether it would be Western or European or American, making Donbas an instrument for pushing regime change in Kyiv, agreeing with Russian demands on Donbas. It means that there will be no deal on special status of Donbas. To sum it up, so that means that Ukraine value both possible US decisions to strengthen its army and European diplomatic efforts of keeping Russia on the escalation track. The challenge, of course, in our opinion, is whether America and the key European players can re-establish consensus on policy toward Russian aggression in Ukraine. So, this is basically.
Thank you. We will continue discussing the situation in Ukraine with Volodymyr Dubovyk from Mechnikov National University in Odessa, discussing Ukraine-US relations under the Trump administration.
Right, thank you, Marlene. It's good to be here. Before I proceed with my presentation, I would like to advertise a little book that we've just produced. Yeah, I brought it from Odessa just days ago. It actually came out of print just figuratively several days ago. It's a publication produced by a number of fellows at my department in Odessa National University at the IR department. And a segment, a chapter by Polina is there, and one by myself, which is on US-Ukraine relations, which is my subject. And it has some text in Ukrainian, also text in English. So I'm going to present this one volume to some of our colleagues here in New York, I suppose, because there's little sense would be for bringing it back to Odessa with us. And I think we should give to our colleagues, not just in this country but elsewhere, more of the copies of this book. The subject of US-Ukraine relations is something I've been working on for a number of years, and as far as I can remember, originally the topic of this conference that we are taking part in today was US relations with countries in Eurasia, also space, not just Russia, and that's how I applied to participate. But then, of course, you only have Russia left in a theme, in a subject line of that conference, and that's how Ukraine is somehow maybe seen as a little alien to the subject and the theme of the conference, even though, of course, it's all very much connected. And as you can see, you already had one presentation from our Ukrainian colleague, and then this is one by myself here on US-Ukraine relations. Since Trump came into power, of course, there was a huge surprise for everyone with election results a year ago and how it came out. And even though people, I think, should have been thinking about this eventuality of Trump becoming president, but no one basically did that over a year ago. And that's why in Ukraine specifically we've been caught absolutely off guard by this president, new president, and his appearance in the White House. And surprise was kind of colored initially, at least, in very negative, dark tones. And in a sense, which is natural, we can remember that during election campaign in 2016, that the two main candidates from two main parties really differed drastically in terms of their approach towards Ukraine-Russia conflict, and so on. While on one hand you had a persistent, principled position of Hillary Clinton, speaking tough lines and rhetorics with regard to Russian behavior towards Ukraine. She was one of the first major politicians who compared openly and publicly Putin to Hitler, and the whole situation with Crimea and Donbas to the situation between Germany and Czechoslovakia, say, in 1938 and 1939. There was reason to believe that she was, if elected, to continue perhaps a line of policy which was pursued by the previous administration. Actually, several of our colleagues in Ukraine have been expecting her to be pursuing even tougher policies on Russia. I personally didn't belong to those. I thought that if she was to become a president, that she would more or less would be in the same line with what Obama was doing for 8 years. But that didn't happen anyway, so she didn't get to the White House. Donald Trump did. And of course, many people in Ukraine were worried because Donald Trump's pronouncements during campaign were quite outrageous, if you think about it, for Ukrainians. And I'm not talking about him saying the Ukraine instead of Ukraine, which upsets a lot of people, but that's, you know, that's minor things. But I'm talking about him saying that he understands what Russia does to Ukraine, and we should be understanding of Russia's interests in the region and vis-a-vis Ukraine. And he spoke about sanctions, maybe doing away, maybe modifying those sanctions on Russia. And he even went as far, he said that he would contemplate the idea of looking at recognizing Crimea as a part of Russian Federation and all other things that he said, which made Ukrainians natural supporters of Hillary Clinton, to the extent that it hurt a little bit, it did hurt a little bit our relations, bilateral relations since he becoming to the White House, because of course he harbored some ill feelings about Ukrainians betting on his opponent during the elections. And at certain point of this time, when the Russia story, or Russia collusion story, quotation marks, got too hot and too heated for him as a way of destruction, he came out, I remember, for a few days at least, and not himself personally, the president, but also his surrogates was media, like Fox News, primarily Hannity, of course, and others, with this idea of Ukraine collusion story instead, and that was there for a couple of weeks at least, and I was afraid at that point of time that it might become a bigger permanent feature that would negatively affect the future of bilateral relations, but it didn't. Because they kind of dropped that story, because there was no story really there. What happened was, of course, as you might remember, that a bunch of Ukrainians came up with this, found these documents, confirming that Paul Manafort, who has been an advisor to President Yanukovych for a number of years, has been paid some money by Ukrainian government, by Ukrainian president, and he signed in certain documents, financial, not financial, kind of informal documents, but he signed for the money that he received in Ukraine. And the question was then open, like, did he actually pay any taxes here in this country on those fees that he has received from Ukrainian leadership at that point of time? And the problem, of course, was, I don't think in this audience I should remind that, but that Manafort at that point of time was the head of election campaign headquarters of Mr. Trump. So that hurt, and that for a number of months early on in Trump's presidency, that was a factor that was taken into account by Ukrainians, that we actually indeed, and like I said, for national reasons, we kind of put all eggs in one basket. We were all expecting Clinton to win, and we were all rooting for Clinton, but other thing happened. Expectations were that now he will be tougher in Ukraine, also because Ukrainians were leaning towards his opponent. Then another thing, of course, that I should mention, that when he became a president, things got complicated for him. Regardless of what he initially wanted to do, perhaps some kind of deal, a bargain with Russia, presumably at the expense of Ukrainian interests. In that deal, some sort of a breakthrough, some sort of a new reset, that didn't materialize, as we know, and on the other hand, he got to understand quickly that he is very much limited and restrained in terms of what he can actually do. With all the talk in recent many years of American presidency becoming more of imperial nature and president doing whatever he wants, specifically in the field of foreign policy, that's not true, and we found out, and we found some good reasons and some good evidence of that not being true with this administration, because, of course, Mr. Trump quickly found out that he is very much limited in what he can do, specifically on Russian dimension of this country's foreign policy, but also on other directions or dimensions of U.S. foreign policy. On Russia, of course, what limits him is continuing various investigations, including the one by special counsel, but many others threats. So that limits him, and a constant, intense interest and a light that's been cast at his campaign connections, and his administration connections to Moscow, That's what limits him very much so. But also the internal power struggle within the White House, that's something that needs to be taken into account, because as you can see, there in the White House there have been several groupings and factions and wings. There you had ideologues, the most dangerous group of people, like Stephen Bannon, who's not there anymore, but Stephen Miller's still there. People who, like Bannon said, that he's a Leninist, speaking of the 100th anniversary of the revolution, meaning that he wants to really change drastically the international system, do away with globalization, with the international order that was in existence, and that brought him close to supporting Putin and getting cozy with Putin, maybe, who has the same idea and agenda in many ways. But Bannon is not there anymore, Miller's still there, but ideologues are kind of undermined a little bit in terms of their influence over the president, even though I think that Trump belongs to them. And if you look actually at some of his interviews and even books produced by the current sitting president, he had some ideas like that before, well before he got to the White House. But then there are other, groupings. There is a family, of course, there. There was, at least for a while, the Republican Party establishment, but since Reince Priebus is out of White House, he was a main kind of guy representing the Republican establishment, who, as you know, of course, in this country, distanced from Trump as well. And that shows in foreign policy quite vividly that a lot of people, even in the Republican Party, who are the top experts in the field of foreign policy and national security, they are not getting anywhere close to this administration in terms of occupying important positions and helping in terms of coming up with some sense for the foreign policy of this country. This is not happening. Many of them signed all these letters calling him incompetent back in 2016. So of course they're not going to be invited to this administration. And that shows who is actually running Ukrainian policy, who's running Ukrainian dimension. That's a big question. We don't know. I mean, I've talked about the White House a little bit. The trend with previous administrations was that NSC was getting more and more influential, but with this administration we don't see any evidence in support of that notion that the National Security Council is getting influential. And in fact, I don't hear much in terms of what is the influence or impact on decision making by Fiona Hill at all. Who is now the senior director, of course, for that part of the world. Even with the Obama administration, somehow, who was known, that administration was known and notorious for being very non-transparent, non-leaky. We still were hearing bits and pieces of what's going on within the White House and who's advocating which approach. But with this current administration, which is extremely leaky, but we don't hear much about what NSC is doing, what Fiona Hill is doing. And that's strange, and I think it's revealing that there's not much to leak. There is no substance, there is no policies, there is no strategy, and therefore, what kind of leaks are we to expect to come out of this administration? So that's interesting. It was the State Department, of course, that Tillerson is basically an outsider as well, and of course, mildly putting it, his connection to president is damaged in many ways, and of course, there's not a single day goes on without someone mentioning that maybe if not tomorrow, then day after tomorrow he'll be gone from that position. So that doesn't really reinforce his role, his impact in terms of decision making in the field of foreign policy. So in terms of the vice president of this country, that's interesting, of course, because they differ drastically on approaches to foreign policy even during the campaign. You might remember that. One day you had presidential debates and one sort of ideas were on the table, and then the next day there was a vice presidential debate, and Mike Pence was coming up with absolutely different sorts of ideas. So that's interesting. But how much influence Mike Pence has on Trump, that's another question that is not, which is kind of left untouched there, and we don't have clear answers. The other limitations on Trump, of course, has been Congress, who imposed sanctions on him. In many ways, and a lot of people in Ukraine are confused about that, because they say, look, the Trump must be a good thing for Ukraine because he signed into the new sanctions on August 2nd this year into law. But we might remember that he's done that very reluctantly and grudgingly, and he also added one-page note, where he explains actually what he thinks about those sanctions and how he strongly dislikes them. The sanctions that he wanted to do away with Russia, on Russia, or maybe modify some of them, I think that he's still maybe waiting for the right moment to do that, but it might be complicated for him. He might not find that moment given the current circumstances and how heated the whole discussion is on his connection to Russia. On little weapons, should they be given to Ukraine or not? We know the plan is there. We know the expert community here in this country is very much divided on this subject. With the previous administration, there was a lot of people who advocated giving Ukraine little weapons, but Obama decided with his innermost inner circle of advisors not to do that. Will this administration do this? We'll see that. About that, the Kurt Walker is a new player. I'm about to conclude. That's interesting. Of course, in Ukraine, there is a tendency, I should tell my American colleagues here, of maybe exaggerating the influence that Walker has with this administration. A lot of people in Ukraine think that what Walker says publicly in his very outspoken interviews often, and very tough rhetorics in Russia, is a line that he's presenting the view of the entire administration, that he's the top authority on Ukraine within this administration, and I happen to disagree on that assumption. I think that Walker is just one of those players, competing for the influence on the foreign policy of this country towards Ukraine. And most finally, of course, with this administration, the Minsk format has not been approached anymore under this administration as something as sacred as it was under Obama. We already heard Walker and others speaking about maybe Minsk not being a guiding format or framework for Ukraine, and understanding of Ukraine's argument that we cannot fulfill our obligations under the situation when another side who also signed those agreements are not fulfilling any of their own agreements. So that's very much open situation there, and we are left there to monitor and track more developments in the coming months and years. Thank you.
We'll be now shifting to the other difficult issue, that of Syria, with first Ekaterina Stepanova from IMEMO Moscow discussing Russia's conflict management in Syria, regionalization and implication for Geneva and the US.
Thank you, Marlene. And again, apologies, but this is the overall design of this panel for us making a jump to an entirely different context, an entirely different region. I will try to confine my talk to three issues. First of all, what's the cutting edge of Russia's policy now on Syria? What is the critical vector? Second, what is the biggest challenge? What is the big, in the offing, if you like, looming challenge? And thirdly, what is the role for the US in all this? Is the US, how much is the US relevant? Is it as relevant as it was 2 years from now? What has changed? Or on the contrary, which patterns are more kind of patterns of continuity? As you probably remember, 2 years, and to be precise, 2 years and 1 month ago, Russia basically took a decision, decided to go for a military track on Syria. And at that time, this connection, this link to the dynamics, very troubled, very uneasy dynamics of the US-Russia relations was very close. The connection was very close. I would even, and I have argued all the way, that one of the primary drivers behind Russia's decision to upgrade its involvement to a military engagement was directly linked to the to relations with the West, and the crisis in relations with the West and with the United States specifically. And the goal was to force, at the time, the Obama administration, to start talking to us again, to Russia again, at least on issues of mutual security concern. And you could argue there were other additional goals linked to the US. For instance, one consideration might have actually been to force the US, by upgrading Russia's own engagement, to actually catalyze US own engagement, which was lacking at the time, to force the US to upgrade its campaign against Daesh, the ISIS, for instance. But sitting as we are now, end of 2017, I would say that today, as of now, Russia's the critical vector of Russia's policy on Syria is no longer primarily shaped either by the dynamics of Russia's relations with the United States, or even by the military track as such, by the military track per se. I know Pavel will be talking more about the military counter-terrorist angle, so I'll leave this for a moment. But I would argue that the two main dimensions now are, first of all, regionalization of Russia's Syria policy, a shift from what was a primarily Western, US-centered approach to a region-centered approach, best symbolized, of course, by the Astana format and by the Astana ceasefire process. So I would argue the main thing that changed politically over these 2 years is not even directly related to the United States. Okay, which doesn't mean they don't have a role to play, they're not important, they're not relevant. And the second dimension would be, again, not so much the military track per se, but rather the dynamic interplay of force and talks. It's almost unavoidable background to any transition from conflict to peace, but specifically in Syria. Basically, the interplay, and at times a very tense relationship between negotiating track and the military track. Just a couple of words on what is this regional dimension. What is Russia's regional track for those who do not care about this part of the world or are not well familiar with the context. As of now, Russia's regional track on Syria involves at least 7 regional powers, 7 countries, apart from Syria as such. Okay, so Turkey, Iran, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. In some way or another, more directly or less directly, but at least 7 countries. And they could be grouped in 3 layers or tiers. You know, the first tier are basically the Astana co-brokers. So for Russia, it happened that the regional track blended with the negotiating track into the Astana ceasefire negotiations, co-brokered with Turkey, which was absolutely central for this entire initiative, and with Iran. One thing that Astana did was it actually addressed at least 3 deficiencies of the previous formats, including higher level formats, UN formats, Geneva, Geneva 1 through 3. There were several rounds, attempts to manage the Syrian conflict. The problem with those attempts were not that they did not address the substance. That's the job of the UN level format, to actually address real substantive issues, the real incompatibilities over which the parties were fighting, intra-Syrian parties in particular. Elections, constitution, political transition, all the serious issues. Federalization, Kurdish issue, degree of autonomy, degree of centralization, decentralization. The problem with Geneva was that there was no preparatory work done before you could actually start addressing the substantive issues. So 3 big problems. You could call them technical, but without them, no progress was possible. First, Geneva did not involve most key militant players on the ground. Okay, it involved a lot of émigré politicians who represented no one but themselves, but all the key groups, most of them were not represented, the so-called veto players on the ground. The second problem was that most of Geneva rounds were not accompanied by any ceasefire, and in any case Geneva was not based on a lasting ceasefire. Okay, and the third point was that it did not account properly for interests of regional powers, and they are huge when it comes to Syria. Okay, so, but before even these 3 technical deficiencies could be addressed, 2 military things had to be sorted out. Well, along the military counter-terrorist track. One needed to correct the military balance on the ground in favor of the government forces, which was on the verge of, beginning to collapse, as of the summer 2015. And that was the purpose of Russia's engagement. The second military condition was intensified pressure against transnational jihadist forces that are not Syria focused primarily. That refers mainly to Daesh, to ISIS, and also to Al-Qaeda linked groups. And that task was addressed, yes, by two separate efforts, yes, by two parallel campaigns, by two very different coalitions that do not properly coordinate, but ultimately they emerge as parallel efforts towards the same goal. So basically, the United States, as you know, is not part of Astana as a broker, it's an observer, but the upgrade of US-led campaign against Daesh helped create one of the two basic conditions for Astana ceasefire talks to start. So there was a very important US role here from the very beginning. Now, what 7 rounds of Astana talks that we've had this year did achieve was that they did address fully or in part all these 3 deficiencies. Okay, that haunted the Geneva process and prevented the discussion of really important political issues, issues about the future system in Syria, to start in earnest. Basically, Astana has already produced the longest lasting ceasefire in Syria, which holds by and large, despite all complications. And it produced 4 de-escalation zones, which is kind of a hybrid, ceasefire, humanitarian safe haven area. There are many problems with Astana implementation, with the ceasefire implementation. Most of them relate to this dynamic interplay of force and talks. Ceasefire introduces its own logic and dynamics that may be in conflict with the purely military logic, because military operations against jihadists continue, they go on. So all these issues of delineation, discrimination between ceasefire and non-ceasefire forces, excessive reaction, retaliation in response to provocation by non-ceasefire forces, they are all relevant. There's a lot of spoiling going on both sides. There is some spoiling by external actors that are not part of the ceasefire. But there is also, actually, this spoiling by regional powers is in decline. It's going down as they develop an interest in a stake in negotiated settlement. But there's a lot of spoiling here and there, both on the government side in Syria and on the side of the opposition. What is important is that we are already reaching the stage in Syria when you can see that even further extension of the ceasefire regime, for instance, there's a badly needed 5th de-escalation zone in the Kurdish Afrin in the north to prevent clashes between pro-Turkish and Kurdish forces in the north. Even that cannot already outgrows the Astana format, cannot be solved on the basis of Astana talks, because it all, once you raise the Kurdish issue, it comes to autonomy, it comes to degree of centralization, decentralization, it touches upon political issues. So it goes beyond the ceasefire. Just very briefly, I just mentioned the second layer of Russia's regional dimension from Russia's standpoint, which is Egypt. But also Jordan and Israel. And the US has a very important mediating role at this dimension, because the southern de-escalation zone in Syria, on the border with Jordan and with Israel, could not be addressed within the Astana format because it involves Iran. So a separate Amman process was co-brokered by Russia, United States, Israel and Jordan, which shows that well, I'll try to really wrap up quickly, but
1 minute, Katya.
Okay, but it shows that the US can constructively engage in a multilateral in this case ceasefire format, even when it is not, when in a crisis where it does not dominate militarily, and in a crisis where it does not claim the role of an omnipotent military hegemon. I would draw your attention to the Amman process in Syria as perhaps an early, so far really rare sign of normalization of US involvement in regional conflict management, and my guess would be that we will see more of it in the future. Just to conclude very briefly, because we need to link this to the US. Under Trump, this is really the final thing. Well, what seemed initially as total lack of strategy by the Trump administration on the Middle East actually morphed into at least 3 broad dimensions, which ironically appear to be rather traditional for the US policy in the Middle East, and perhaps a bit shaken during the Obama administration. So direction number 1, recommitment to Israel's security. This is not a new thing, okay? Which in turn dictates, in a way, or precipitates harsher approach, tougher approach to Iran. Second, commitment to the Gulf, security of the Gulf with Saudi Arabia as a central partner. And thirdly, I would say a degree of genuine commitment to anti-terrorism in the Middle East. So we cannot say that there's no policy at all. There is this broad strategic dimension. The problem is that when it comes to Syria as such, okay, there seemed to be a lack of strategic clarity for all sorts of reasons which we may discuss further. The new reality, the sentence before the last one, okay, the new reality is that this lack of strategic clarity on the part of the US on Syria, due to all this regionalization process that happened, no longer can fundamentally alter the balance on the ground or undermine, affect the Astana process or anything. Unfortunately, this lack of strategic clarity becomes a larger problem once we move from the ceasefire format to the higher level UN, Geneva format, which will address substantive political issues on Syria that Astana is not a substitute for addressing. I have to stop here.
I would like to give the floor to Pavel Bayev from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, discussing the Syrian test for the proposition for cooperation with Russia in counter-terrorism.
Indeed, this proposition for this cooperation appears very obvious. What can the West, United States in particular, cooperate in Russia with? Counterterrorism comes on the top of nearly every list. Probably in a week, Trump will meet Putin again in Vietnam. That will be a topic they will be discussing. They cannot discuss sanctions, they cannot discuss arms control, they cannot discuss even North Korea. It doesn't make sense to discuss it with Russia. It is a topic for discussion with China. Counterterrorism is there always to say, and in fact, starting point for my thinking in this direction was a meeting between Lavrov and Mogherini, EU foreign policy czar, when Lavrov said, it's time for us to put away all the artificial disagreements like sanctions and focus on really important matter like cooperation counter terrorism. And I thought, doesn't sound right. Something is wrong about that. And in fact, my bottom line here is that it's exactly the opposite. Disagreements which lead to sanctions are deep and fundamental, and prospects for cooperation in terrorism are entirely artificial and essentially non-existent. Russia cannot be an ally in the struggle against terrorism. And in principle, I can stop here, particularly since was kind enough to install the
That took my 30 minutes.
Still, if they will, if adding a couple of words, I still think it's probably impossible to keep the discussion going. We need something to discuss. Dialogue has a value in itself. this is a topic, let's keep going, only keeping in mind that no practical results could possibly be achieved. It's also important to keep in mind that for Putin it's a trademark theme. He started with that back in '99 with the intervention in Chechnya, and in fact making a full circle. Now we have an intervention in Syria. Sort of in between these two interventions, a lot has happened with the topic of counterterrorism. It blended in a very peculiar way with the struggle against revolution. So counterterrorism and counter-revolutionism in the Russian policy making are blending together in a very peculiar fashion. And I had already wrote about that issue a few years back. And on this particular issue, besides this memo report will be coming from IFRI, I hope, during this month. So you will have options to read, not just to take my word for that. What is, I think, important to watch in this topic is how, besides blending with the struggle against revolution, this topic of cooperation in counterterrorism is narrowed down, very often reduced to cooperation in Syria. Like it's the same thing. We cooperate in counterterrorism, it means Syria. And I argue it isn't. Cooperation in Syria is not possible for all sorts of other reasons. Yes, it is a very moving target, this intervention. It started as one thing, evolved and mutated on something else. Will probably continue to mutate as Russia is sinking deeper into that quagmire. But it's essentially a different topic altogether, particularly now when the ISIS is defeated. For Russia, this intervention was never really specifically about ISIS, but it was a convenient to camouflage it as a counter-terrorist, part of counter-terrorist operation. But now it is essentially makes it a very separate topic for cooperation. And in counter-terrorism, in principle, 3 areas could be identified as promising. And one of them is uncovering the networks, which are also mutating and changing. And not that long time ago, main networks were from the North Caucasus and Chechnya in particular. That was where all sort of threats were migrating from Russia into the West, and cooperation never happened. I think Boston Marathon was one example of that. Even after that, not possible really to find a common language. Now we have a different mutation in this network. It's much more about Central Asia, migrants from Central Asia, how these networks are becoming radicalized and becoming a vehicle for terrorism. And we had that kind of manifestation of that in Istanbul, in Stockholm, in St. Petersburg, and now in New York. Too many examples to be just a coincidence. And how this radicalization happened, we see it happens very differently in the United States, where all these people migrate as entirely secular and non-radicalized, mostly refugees, and becoming radicalized. Interesting topic for discussion. Very different situation how it happens in Moscow, due to kind of all sort of exploitation of cheap labor, slave labor, essentially. That is something Moscow is not prepared to discuss, and I don't see how any discussion on that matter can bring any result. The second topic is money. Money for feeding the terrorist networks, and again, it's always interesting to follow the money. It's always very productive to try to squeeze the terrorist financing. Problem is that export of corruption from Russia is now recognized as a direct security challenge in Europe, and a lot of efforts are focused on that. Sanctions or no sanctions, it's generally a very, very healthy process in many ways, exterminating this export of corruption, and because of that, trying to make a joint efforts on targeting that money when struggle against this money is now a main priority is extremely difficult. And the third direction is propaganda. Joining efforts in addressing the threat of propaganda, and it's impossible for a kind of entirely different set of reasons. Even in U.S. State Department, funding for countering ISIS propaganda and Russian propaganda now come under the same in the same pot of money. Try to separate that. It's essentially the same people who are doing who are doing countering the Russian propaganda and countering the propaganda from ISIS. I don't really see how that dimension, which is now incredibly hot, can be productive. What is then the focus of this discussion, of that dialogue? It's just exchange of words. I think there is a very particular risks involved in the fact that again Russia feels that it's a topic where a lot of expertise and experience is accumulated, and Russia has also missed a year in its proactive policy. In year 14 it was Crimea and Ukraine, in the year 15 it was Syria, in the year 16 it was cyber dimension and attack on US elections. In the year 17 so far nothing happened. The year is not yet done, but we might see something interesting. But I think it's very important to engage in sort of preemptive dissuasion of Russia in saying, that is not an area where you can hope to achieve something. Yes, there is experience and there are interesting opportunities and openings, but you rather not entertain thinking about that, because that is really something where it can backfire really badly. That's it. Thank you very much.
We only have 5 minutes for discussion, but we can take a little bit over the next panel, which has only 3 speakers, and then there will be the coffee break, so we can have more time. So let's collect several questions and see if we have a kind of Ukraine discussion and a kind of Syria discussion, and if the two are connected, that's very good. Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Martin. I have a small comment that's not really a question, but just for Pavlovayev. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but some of the most creative work on counter-propaganda right now is not being done by the US government. It's being done by Jigsaw, which is a Google private affiliate that has a program called Redirect. And what they're doing is using their commercial technology that you can direct advertisements to particular groups to find people who are searching for things that would seem to imply that they're interested in joining the Islamic State, and then sending them, sending them as possibilities that look attractive, not physically sending them, but showing them opportunities, where you have video of people talking about how terrible the Islamic State actually is to live under.
Let's collect several.
Okay, let's collect several.
Regina.
Regina Smith, Indiana University. Ekaterina, I want to ask you a question that was even outside of your talk a little bit, but with recent changes in Saudi Arabia and the role that Saudi Arabia has been playing in the discussion, how do you see that altering this situation, if at all?
Sir?
Yeah, Chaim Braun from Odessa, Stanford. This is for Volodymyr. Could you please comment on potential irritant in US-Ukraine relations that have to do with the alleged leakage of cruise missile technology to Iran in the past, and the more recent alleged leakage of missile technology and ICBM rocket engines from Yuzbash to North Korea?
Tadej, would you like to?
Kim, there is no denial of the fact that yes, countering this propaganda is an extremely important thing. And there are interesting actors who are focusing on that. They are also focusing, in fact, now on countering the Russian propaganda in much the same way. The recent hearings in the US Congress for Facebook and Twitter, I think, was very instructive in this dimension. When they were saying, it's your responsibility. You have to do something about it. My point is that whatever interesting work these actors will be doing, and Google is doing, it is not something where Russia can formally cooperate with the United States. I don't think Russia is really very interested in cooperating with Google, particularly on the state-to-state level, where it is just no-go. Russia is probably more interested in following Chinese example and banning Google, as it did with LinkedIn.
Google's not a state actor, and Jigsaw is not acting on behalf of the U.S. government.
Of
So
course,
it's a separate
yes.
question.
Ekaterina.
Quickly on Saudi Arabia, I even mentioned it as one of the 7 countries which Russia sees as partners, in finding a negotiated end out of the Syrian war. And the succession in Saudi Arabia did play a role. As you know, we've just had King Salman's visit, official visit to Moscow, first ever historically by Saudi monarch. And although we have a lot of things to discuss beyond Syria, from energy issues to large investment projects, Saudi investment projects, to arms sales potentially now. But Syria was a major issue under discussion, and the Saudis, well, first they were distracted a bit by the Yemen, where they are more directly involved, but without their cooperation we would have problems starting perhaps the Astana process, because the main thing, you need veto players on the ground to be present, and Saudi Arabia played a critical role to have the main Saudi-backed group in Syria, Jaish al-Islam. Actually, its leader showed up even at the first round of Astana, and continuously and increasingly they're helpful, I would say. And generally we are now in a situation, and I would say that is one of the most significant changes, that most regional powers have developed a stake and they rally now to seek a negotiated solution to the war in Syria, which gives us some hope. Just two reactions to what Pavel said. First of all, I think both North Korea and the Middle East will be discussed this week at the Trump-Putin meeting and the APEC summit forum in Vietnam. Both will be discussed. I mean, for Trump, North Korea is a more imminent issue. For Russia, the Middle East. Putin wants to discuss Syria and the Middle East. And second, I would caution very much against oversimplifying or trying to reduce the problem of this self-generate new type of terrorist cells that we have in Russia, which are distinct from North Caucasian violent underground and not related even to the North Caucasian agenda. This is a new type of terrorist and violent extremist threat that we face. And it has closer similarities to what they've seen, what was happening in Europe. This self-generating jihadi cells, and partly in the US, a lot of similarities. But I would caution against trying to blame it all on migrants from Central Asia. The majority of the members of the cells are Russian citizens. Some are migrants, but it's mostly Russian Muslims and Russian converts to Islam. And despite the fact that behind the latest attack that we had in St. Petersburg metro, it was indeed done by, I mean, the network behind it were Central Asians, but, inspired at least by ISIS. But again, that should not obscure the fact that we are now at the stage of the first generation migration, labor migration. So the bulk of the absolute majority of Muslim migrants to Russia are not radicalized. Okay, so there are other problems as well. So sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly, I mean, that story on North Korea was quite quickly dropped, actually, and went out of everybody's attention for various reasons. First of all, the authors of the piece haven't done a very good investigation, and they actually distorted the actual report that was produced by IISS on that subject, and then other experts in the field, they came out and they said that disagree with the findings of that report in that article. So in that particular respect, the story wasn't just sustained as a factor in bilateral relations, but maybe Polina, it's her field of expertise, might add something on more authoritative.
Yeah, as for these experts of Ukrainian technologies, it was just a speculation, because everyone knows it's some details were produced by Yuzhmash, but it was assembled in Russia. So with this very responsibility, we can say that Russia can be blamed. Moreover, you know, it's very strange that the United States are always trying to diminish the self-capabilities of Iran and North Korea, because they were cooperating in the missile industry for many years. Since the beginning of 1990s, they were using all Soviet Scud missile types for producing their missiles, plus Abdul Qadir Khan network from Pakistan added to this. So this cooperation, clandestine cooperation of North Korea and Iran lasts for a long time, and they are really very prominent in this development. In North Korean scientists, researchers, and Iranian researchers are very good in producing missiles. So there is no need to sell some kind of Ukrainian engines because they are very self-sufficient and they exchanging the technologies. It's even known that the first Iranian Shahab-3 missile was in fact created, it was an Nodon model from North Korea, which was made from the Soviet Scud missile. And then it was, it was improved up to the latest Iranian missiles model. So there is no, there is no evidence of the Ukrainian contribution to this, as well as probably Russian contribution.
Thank you.
But isn't the Ukrainian state still investigating whether there was a rogue actor from Yuzhmash that contributed to it?
There's nothing
no.
to investigate, actually.
No, it's
There is nothing to investigate.
there is nothing to investigate. It was the official publication of Yuzhmash which was clarifying this issue, and there is no any kind of evidence to suspect that Yuzhmash has ever been involved in any kind of clandestine missile technologies or sale of technologies. It's absolutely hollow convictions, and I don't think that there is any kind of real ground to discuss them in the serious way. Yeah.
Thank you.
A very short last question.
Oh, very short. Well, I'll shorten it.
Yes.
Is there more cooperation between Ukraine and maybe a common ground with Europe and the United States on Russian interference in potentially Ukrainian upcoming election?
Well, Misha, I haven't heard of any cooperation in that respect.
Well, you should.
I think
I strongly urge you.
I think Ukrainian still has some to offer to Mr. Mueller's team, yeah, but and probably working with him, but we wouldn't know, and that's a good thing, right? But in terms of Americans helping us to withstand certain Russian intervention or hacking or anything of that sort, in terms of oncoming elections in Ukraine, I haven't heard of any such interaction or cooperation.
Okay.
You know, Misha, when Theresa May had very unfortunate elections, it was said, no Russian interference is found, which is a new escalation of hybrid war.
On that, that's a good way to conclude our panel. We will be moving directly to the next one. So I will invite the three speakers for the next one to come and please join me.